Just who are the real victims of Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people? Now, many of you might think that's an easy one to answer. It's the Palestinian people. After all, tens of thousands have been slaughtered, many of them children. The survivors forcibly displaced, many of them maimed, starved, deprived of the essentials of life, their homes destroyed, living in an apocalyptic wasteland, grieving for their loved ones, wondering every moment if it will be their turn to be killed. Of course, on every day, it is that moment for many of them to be killed. Well, it turns out not. Those aren't the real victims. The real victims, it turns out, are in fact Labour politicians who lost their seat in the general election last week, partly because of voters angry about Israel's genocide in Gaza. Yeah, that's right. They're the ones who are really suffering right now. They're the ones we should have in our thoughts. Let's start with our first victim. Please do get your violins out for Thangam Debonair. She was a shadow cabinet minister, Labour. She lost her seat in Bristol, central to the Green Party's co-leader, Carla Denyer. When I say she lost her seat, it was a safe Labour seat, and the Green candidate, Carla Denyer, won 56.6% of the vote, or over 24,000 votes, compared to 32.6% of the Debonair and her just over 14,000 votes, meaning a majority of over 10,000 for the Greens. A decisive, massive swing by the Greens. Let's just have a little listen to Thangam Debonair.
It's easy to craft a narrative that goes, your MP didn't vote for a ceasefire, if your own party hasn't said, we voted twice for a ceasefire and publicly. And yeah, of course, it wasn't like we hid it, but we did not craft a narrative, in my view, or if we did, I didn't see it. And other colleagues suffered terribly, worse than me.
Let's just start with that, shall we? Debonair claims the problem here is that the Greens were allowed to get away with saying she hadn't voted for a ceasefire because, and then she blames the fact that Labour didn't come out and say otherwise. The big problem, she says, was Labour didn't craft a narrative. Let's just start with this part about the narrative. Labour did craft a narrative. What she said there isn't true. Labour had a narrative. In October last year, Keir Starmer publicly declared that Israel had the right to cut off water and energy. He defended and refused to condemn that war crime of siege, not once, but in other interviews that day too, a fact which is conveniently memory hold. He sent shadow cabinet ministers on television afterwards who refused to condemn such a grave, grave war crime, including his then shadow attorney general, my MP, Emily Thornberry, who not only refused to condemn that war crime, but repeatedly refused to denounce it on the grounds that Israel had an absolute right to self-defence. David Lammy, Shadow Foreign Secretary, another lawyer, refused to condemn the mass forcible displacement of the Palestinian population in Gaza as a war crime. Now, instead of apologising for what he had said, and which we can hear because he said it, Starmer let all that stand until 2 weeks later because there was clearly mounting anger in certain Labour supporting constituencies. And he didn't apologise then either, but simply tried to gaslight us into believing he had never believed Israel had the right to commit the war crime of cutting off water, energy and other essentials of life, when we could all, again, hear what he had said. For months, Labour continued to back this genocidal rampage, refused to condemn it, refused to condemn a single war crime, and still to this day refuses to condemn Israel for war crimes, when it has no problem whatsoever, correctly, for condemning the Russian state for war crimes in Ukraine. It hasn't waited there for an official legal judgment in a court. Putin hasn't been tried. We know he's committing war crimes. The same applies there. They won't apply that same standard. Despite multiple statements of genocidal intent by Israeli leaders and officials from day one, despite on a daily basis, overwhelming evidence of hideous war crimes and war crimes against humanity, they supported that on the basis of self-defence. When predominantly Muslim Labour councillors resigned en masse, a party official briefed the press that Labour was, and I'm quoting, shaking off the fleas. Shadow ministers who supported a ceasefire were forced to resign or sacked. 2 Labour MPs were suspended, one for saying Israel was committing genocide on the day the International Court of Justice put Israel on trial for alleged genocide, the other for calling for Israelis and Palestinians to live together in perfect harmony between the river and the sea. When the British government cut funding to UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, Gaza's main humanitarian agency, on the basis of Israeli lies, which have collapsed under actual scrutiny, Labour came out and legitimised that decision. And that decision alone has cost God knows how many lives. In November last year, despite being absolutely crystal clear that Israel was committing some of the worst crimes of the 21st century, Labour abstained on a ceasefire and was publicly backing Israel's so-called right to defence, which we have seen, have we not, how that has been put into practice every single day since the 7th of October. What did Thangam Debonair do? She abstained, in line with what the Labour leadership expected. She had a choice there. She could have resigned, but she did not resign. Whatever my disagreements with her, the Shadow Minister, Jess Phillips, also with similar politics to Thangam Debonair, she did resign. Now, given she only just kept her seat in this election, she hung on to that seat, I think that was driven by career self-preservation. But whatever, it was the right decision. That underlines Thangam Debonair had a choice. She chose not to act on it. Now, Thangam Debonair thought this was about having the wrong narrative and that it just needs to be explained differently. She could have done so. I approached her for an interview, and this is what happened.
Hey, Thangam, it's Owen. Just did a quick video about the election, so we're going around and... So just wondering, how's it going? How's the campaign going?
We're just about to go out canvassing.
Oh, I know, but we just want to ask a couple of questions, if that's all right. I was just wondering, on Gaza, it keeps coming up at the moment. Do you think arms sale embargo, because at the moment it's easy to say...
If you don't mind, you're actually interrupting.
Do you want to drop us an email and we'll set something up for a proper chat?
I would know many of the sorts of people who watch my videos are the sorts of people who live in Bristol and are sympathetic to the Green Party and indeed voted for the Green Party. She could have spoke directly to them. She chose not to. After this, the journalist Helen Lewis, who, like quite a lot of my colleagues, has quite the personal grudge, not least because my colleagues believe that me criticising the industry in which I work is an act of violence, wrote during the campaign, Owen Jones turned up here during the campaign to demand Debonair answer his questions on Gaza, which is apparently part of this constituency on its new boundaries. Really just goes to show, really, doesn't it, what I'm working with here in this particular industry. This shows an absolute abject lack of interest in the humanity of Palestinians. Would Helen Lewis have said this if I'd interrogated a reform candidate about Ukraine? Would she have gone, oh, Ukraine, clear? Does he think that's part of the constituency? No, she would not. And if she had, by the way, could have been career-ending, I would say. She would have been publicly vilified across the British media for saying anything like that. But she knew she could say that about Gaza, didn't she? She knew she could get away with that and that would have no consequences for her whatsoever. But I was right, wasn't I? I was also right. By Debonair's own admission, Gaza did matter to a lot of voters in Bristol, even if their disillusionment with Labour goes deeper than Gaza. Helen Lewis subsequently compared me to far-right extremists in the US because I dared to try and ask a publicly accountable would-be government minister about genocide. Again, that's what we're working with. Let's listen a bit more to Thangam, shall we?
I think the party does need to look at the playbook, not just of the Greens, but of Reform and the Independents, because they all use the same playbook. They didn't always use the same script, although sometimes it was overlapping. But it's a danger if you get in the habit as a campaigning political party of saying things that are actually not true, but sound good. I actually did vote for a ceasefire, not once, but twice. And our motion, our amendment to the motion in February, that got through unanimously for all sorts of reasons, but it did. One of them being we knew how to handle parliaments. Now, that wasn't what the Green Party sent out. And it was difficult because I kind of knew from November that I was going to lose the seat because I thought this is what they'll use. And if my party doesn't communicate what we've done, what we're saying, then obviously voters don't know it. They don't follow every tiny twist and turn of politics. They're not all on Twitter. And by the time people have got a belief in their heads and you're on the doorstep saying, no, I voted for it twice, they don't believe you anymore.
So to be blunt, your opponents lied and your party failed to tackle the lies. Is that the playbook you were talking about?
It's more subtle. On the leaflets that they put out, they didn't say that I'd voted against the ceasefire, but people interpreted that from them saying she failed to vote for a ceasefire motion. True, I failed to vote for one because it didn't mention the hostages.
So she tries to suggest that the Greens lied here. They did not lie. They correctly said she failed to vote for the ceasefire motion. It took Labour 4 months to publicly back a ceasefire. That includes Thangam Debonair, again, Shadow Cabinet Minister, or was. So Labour waited for tens of thousands of Palestinians to be sorted, many of them kids. It's not just kids, by the way, that matter. Obviously, it's particularly distressing and sickening. But women and men who were innocent as well. But it took tens of thousands of people who were killed, and that's only the most extreme manifestation of the consequences of this horror, until Labour finally changed official tack on one of the worst crimes of our age. But it gets worse. What actually forced this wasn't sort of a moral position, wasn't from morality. It was a growing backlash, which, as we can see, went on to deprive them of seats. And the Scottish National Party had put down a motion which held Israel to account for collective punishment, as well as calling for an immediate ceasefire. Now, Starmerstein briefed journalists that he hated the inclusion of collective punishment in that motion, understandably, because it would mean then consequences for Israel beyond hand-wringing, which Israel just ignores. It would mean having to take actual concrete action, like ending arms sales, like imposing sanctions. Labour then briefed that they'd blackmailed the Speaker of the House of Commons, a former Labour MP, that if he didn't trash that SNP motion so there could be a watered-down Labour version, stripping away collective punishment, he would lose his job. That's what Thangham means about understanding Parliament. And then Labour drove through a motion which didn't tangibly differ from the Conservative position or indeed the Biden administration's position. It was so milquetoast and platitudinous, that's why it passed unanimously in the House of Commons. Didn't mean anything, it had no teeth. It was done simply to placate huge growing anger over this monstrous crime. Now, Thangham Debonair has the audacity to suggest if only voters had been on Twitter more, they'd be more informed about Labour's real position. I think if we had a detailed study, we'd find actually regular users of Twitter are far more critical of Labour over Gaza, largely because they're witnessing atrocities that most of the media is not even accurately showing. The fact is, what the Green Party said was entirely accurate, and frankly, Debonair deserves all the condemnation she has got for failing to take a stand against, and I really must emphasise this point, mass murder. Let's listen more.
It's easy to craft a narrative that goes, your MP didn't vote for a ceasefire, if your own party hasn't said, we voted twice for a ceasefire and publicly, and other colleagues suffered terribly, worse than me.
Goodness grief. Goodness grief. Other colleagues suffered terribly more. Suffered. This is a discussion about the political consequences of the mass slaughter of innocent people. And she's talking about MPs being victims. Look, let's be clear. So there was not an attempt to distort what I'm saying here. There was never any excuse for threatening an MP. No one should ever do that, whatever the circumstances. It is, however, abundantly clear that these MPs are conflating scrutiny and, yes, fierce, passionate criticism. We are, of course, discussing genocide here. That's been conflated with threats and would-be violence. That's the problem. Indeed, listen on.
You know, some of what I had to put up with was bad. There was a billboard, a huge one, 10 metres away from my house at 2 days to poll, and your MP didn't vote for a ceasefire, still want to vote Labour or something like that with blood dripping off it, which was horrible. Now, when we were driving past and I had my mum in the car, I had to go, look, a squirrel! And bless her, she did actually look, so she never saw the billboard. But feeling protective of my staff, my volunteers and my parents, my family, that was very hard.
I'm sorry, but actually that's nauseating. If you're a senior figure in a political party whose leader backed war crimes, whatever he then said, which has consistently up to this very moment not once condemned Israel for one single war crime, which has still not ended arms sales, let alone called for that in opposition, which repeatedly defended Israel's military onslaught despite the hideous consequences, and which has monstered and defamed and purged opponents of that genocide. If you're a senior figure in that political party with that record during the mass slaughter of innocent people, which in concrete terms, let me just be clear here, I'm sorry to say this, involves children being slowly cooked to death under rubble and newborn babies having their tiny little limbs amputated without anaesthetic, then you're going to have to accept some voters are going to get pretty angry. How do you think history is going to record this sort of pity me party, given what we're witnessing in Gaza? That billboard may well have personally been very distressing for you, Thangham Debonair, but not as distressing as the actual atrocities being committed by the Israeli state with Western support against innocent people every single day in Gaza, which your constituents have seen, all too many of them, and they can't unsee what they've seen, knowing you have failed to take a stand when you had the chance. And that is one reason, not the only reason, but one reason why you have legitimately lost your seat. Let's listen to this.
The lack of a strong narrative had consequences. I actually felt in many ways the party gave me good support, but there's a certain level of collateral damage which I felt was inevitable from November. And then again in February when the Green Prosperity Plan got cancelled, that was very hard.
I feel like I'm losing my mind here. Part of that she's insulting her own voters, basically suggesting the real reason there was hostility over Gaza is they've not been voters subjected to enough spin from the Labour Party, or the right spin, rather than simply being a case of voters rationally assessing Labour's morally despicable position on Gaza. Park all that. She used the word collateral damage to describe herself. That's the term she just used to describe herself. Let's be clear. Being voted out democratically by her own electorate because they lost confidence in her. That's what happened to her. Collateral damage. That's a term normally used by the likes of the Israeli state when they've just slaughtered a load of innocent people. Is she doing this on purpose? Just listen to this last bit.
And just finally, you said you were going into Parliament today to hand in your pass. What's that going to be like?
Oh, it's going to be horrible. Yeah, it's going to be horrible.
Listening to this, you'd think this is somebody who suffered a terrible personal bereavement, talking through their awful personal tragedy. The real victim here of Israel's genocidal rampage apparently is this Labour MP because she lost an election. The interviewer makes no effort to engage with the actual grievances of the electorate, looking with terrible amounts of sympathy for this horror which poor Thangam Debonair has gone through. No attempt to discuss whether these grievances are legitimate. I've gone through them in the video. She could have interrogated Thangam Debonair about the positions of the Labour Party, which clearly voters have objected to. They weren't duped or lied. Maybe she thinks they were the voters. She could still park that and, in the name of impartiality, at least present them. Britain is a country where the media and politicians treat people objecting to migrants and refugees. That's a legitimate concern. But ordinary voters objecting to how politicians respond to genocide, that doesn't count as a legitimate concern, clearly. In this case, it's like poor old Thangam Debonair has just suffered a terrible personal downfall. Let's just listen to another example, shall we? Jonathan Ashworth, a now former Labour Shadow Minister and MP for Leicester South, who lost his seat democratically to the independent candidate, Shokat Adam.
I'm obviously disappointed to have lost my constituency in pretty brutal circumstances.
Pretty brutal circumstances. Sorry, I have to just stop there. What is it about these people where they keep using violent imagery to describe being voted out democratically by voters who didn't want them anymore, when relating that specifically to the political consequences of a genocidal military onslaught which involves actual brutal circumstances? The campaigning, the anger that voters threw at you may have been upsetting, but talking about brutal circumstances when you are literally talking about anger over... Have you seen what's been happening in Gaza, Jonathan Ashworth? Do you if what you went through is brutal, what the hell is that? Let's carry on.
I've never known a campaign of such vitriol, such bullying, such intimidation. I've never seen a Member of Parliament, Shokat Adam Patel, get elected on the basis of a foul and obnoxious lie that I was responsible for genocide, that I had the blood of Gazan children on my hands. This was his campaign. I had his supporters bullying and intimidating myself and my key supporters in the streets, and he refuses to condemn it. He's actually gone to ground and he's refusing to answer any questions on this. It's very disrespectful to the people of Leicester South.
Foul, obnoxious lies, he puts it. Let's be clear. The objection of these campaigners was that the Labour leadership legitimised a genocidal onslaught, and specifically that it monstered and tried to silence its actual opponents. And those campaigners are absolutely right. That's what happened. That's the facts. I've gone through some of the reasons why, and I would note that it meant the British government of the day did not come under any meaningful pressure from Labour to change tack, which, given public opinion from the start, opposed Israel's genocidal onslaught. That's what the polling shows. Believed overwhelmingly Israel was committing horrific war crimes. Turns out that the electorate have eyes and ears, and opposed continued arms sales to Israel. That pressure would undoubtedly have delivered results. But the opposition instead rallied behind the government, allowing them to continue backing Israel and ensuring Israel had carte blanche from Britain to carry on with this genocidal rampage. Let's carry on.
He's won. I think he's already letting down the people of Leicester South, and he won't be able to deliver change. The improvements in Leicester South to our National Health Service, to the cost of living, to our schools will be because of a Labour government, not an impotent, independent opposition MP.
It's just, it's so disrespectful, suggesting the only MPs that actually matter are government ministers. He says these MPs are impotent. Really, Jonathan, really? Well, we'll see about that, because the fact MPs like you have been defeated over Gaza is far more likely to shift Labour in a different direction on Gaza than clearly anything you've done, which is why you've lost your seat, buddy boy. And I would say, sorry, with all due respect, because you just become chief executive of a think tank called Labour Together, you're the impotent guy now. You thought you were going to be a government minister. Well, you're not. You've had to settle for chief executive of Labour Together. And you think other people are impotent. Congratulations on your new job, by the way. Let's carry on.
A campaign was organised nationally by a national organisation called The Muslim Vote, whose campaign was clear on their website: punish MPs. That's the words they used.
The word was punish, was it?
Punish MPs. It wasn't, we want to effect change on a set of policy issues. Like many of the policy issues I fought on, whether that's calling for a ceasefire, calling for Palestinian statehood, calling for student finance arrangements for Muslim young people in my constituency, punish MPs is what the Muslim Vote organisation talked about.
The way he emphasises the Muslim vote as though that makes it sinister, grim stuff. Organisations which mobilise different demographics, particularly those underrepresented in politics and indeed treated with contempt in our politics, is literally a fundamental part of our democracy. LGBTQ people have always done this, women have done this, black people have done this, and quite rightly so. And then he quotes punish to make it sound sinister. What the Muslim vote said was, and I quote, "We're working so that MPs who didn't vote for a ceasefire are punished." Well, again, Jonathan Ashworth, you failed to vote for ceasefire in November and only belatedly voted for ceasefire 4 months on after tens of thousands were butchered, and only specifically voted for a motion which stripped away any accountability for Israel collective punishment. By punish, and we can hear that in context and what the Muslim vote were aiming to do, because they came out and endorsed certain candidates, what they mean is vote those MPs out of the ballot box. Quite rightly so. That's why you lost. Correctly so. Now, he defends his position by saying, well, he called for a ceasefire. I've covered that. And that he called for Palestinian statehood. I mean, when, Jonathan? When's that? Labour's official position is some undetermined time in the future. Spain, ruled by Labour's sister party, has already come out and recognised Palestine with immediate effect, joining, I would note, most countries on earth. What you're discussing here is a meaningless platitude which your constituents quite correctly have seen through. Let's carry on.
I was chased down the street, shouted at and screamed at for 45 minutes until I had to seek refuge literally in a vicarage, and they waited for me outside the vicarage, and even when I came out of the vicarage they were shouting at me with megaphones.
Do you condemn Netanyahu? Yes or no?
See, I am not going to have these guys.
I'm just a simple question. Do you condemn Netanyahu?
I'm not going to have these guys bullying me off the street.
No one's bullying you. It's a simple question. We're asking you why you abstained for the vote. Yeah, to vote for a ceasefire. It's a simple question. No one's bullying you. If you can't answer the question, say it.
We're not going to have the people intimidate us.
No one's intimidating you.
Leaflets going around accusing me of being Genocide John. Anonymous leaflets, all in the name of the successful candidate who won't be able to do anything, who will stand exposed and impotent, not able to effect change, accusing me of genocide, of having blood on my hands. The vitriol is like something I have never seen, even though I've called for a ceasefire, even though I've called for Palestinian statehood.
Well, I'd love to know what the circumstances are here of being chased into a vicarage. People criticising you over your stance, campaigning in the streets, you're an elected politician, where they're criticising you on one of the great crimes of our age. And I've seen footage of you being asked by constituents. You didn't like it, but they were not threatening you. You might not like it. You might find it upsetting. You might find it embarrassing. But it's not threatening, which I think you conceded there by laughing about it. Now, he keeps using this line about a candidate who replaced him being impotent. I don't know what this obsession with impotence is. I honestly think he's going to achieve a lot more than you have, Jonathan, by piling pressure on the governing party to shift in Gaza. Now, Jonathan doesn't like being denounced over genocide. I've gone through his meaningless platitudes. If you're a leading figure in a political party, now the government, which has taken the morally depraved position it has over Gaza, then some of your voters are going to get upset about it. And yes, in some cases, that means voting you out. That doesn't mean any voter has the right to threaten you. You haven't presented any evidence. I know that they have. If they have, you need to go to the police and you need to present that evidence to the police. That is a police matter. The problem is here is you just don't get it. You're not showing any contrition. These interviews are so revealing about how these politicians think, aren't they? Not just their utter entitlement, which they've not even bothered to suppress, but their lack of humanity. If I were them having been democratically elected, if I were them having been democratically unelected, democratically defeated out the ballot box, which they blame in large part on people's anger on Gaza, I would say this. I'd go, well, look, of course, I understand the utter fury and horror of my constituents. Tens of thousands of our fellow humans, after all, have been butchered in the most hideous circumstances, many of them little children. They've been slaughtered, maimed, starved, their homeland reduced to rubble. Of course, I understand the horror and the anger of this. These are hideous, hideous crimes. And I understand why people are angry, because the British government has backed Israel to the hill and provides arms to Israel. And I regret the failure of my party to offer political and moral leadership. And I would never, ever, ever in any way present myself as the victim. I lost the confidence of my voters. And I want to regain their trust. And I understand how a matter of life and death on such a mass scale has caused distress. I've learned from that, and I'll continue to listen about how we as a party must act on that entirely legitimate anger and fury and distress. That's what they should have done. That's what they should be doing. That's what they should be saying. But they didn't do that, did they? Instead, they're being interviewed as though they're the victims. Tiny violins, total contempt for those who campaigned on the basis of opposing Israel's murderous onslaught from the start, a position which I must say was vindicated in the worst possible way. And I would note those of us who took that position have been repeatedly monstered and, I would just add, constantly subjected to threats of violence and death threats. Alas, that does not qualify, does it, in this particular debate? Now, again, LBC's Andrew Marr there, not even trying to engage with what the voters think. Just listening to poor old Jonathan Ashworth as though he's the victim. If a left-wing Labour MP got voted out by voters objecting, for example, to immigration, do you think they'd be treated as a victim like this? No, they'd be interrogated. They'd be put in the dock, figuratively. But the media class in this country have solidarity with the political class because they fundamentally all have taken a morally repugnant position in Gaza and they all feel contempt about being scrutinised over it. They're not treating voters' anger over this as legitimate because they think that these are the wrong voters and this is the wrong issue. Well, what we're saying here is hubris. Our politicians and our media outlets have clearly failed to draw the right lessons from last week and instead are having the most undignified public pity party. History is going to be damning, by the way. And the political consequences of their contempt has been felt already, but it will only continue. And I just want to add this as a warning. It's very clear that a lot of these Labour MPs regard scrutiny as violence. Actual threats of violence do need to be dealt with. There is never an excuse for violent threats or death threats. MP security does need to be protected. But what is clearly happening is a conflation with passionate and intense scrutiny of a sort which is crucial in a democracy, not least when we're talking about mass murder. And my fear is these people are going to drive through legislation which acts on that conflation and restricts the ability of the public to scrutinise politicians on matters quite literally of life and death. Something for us all to bear in mind. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments. It was a long one, but we had a lot to talk about. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Listen to the podcast. Keep the show on the road at patreon.com/Jersey. I'll speak to you in a bit.